The river wasn't a river anymore. It was a beast. Unchained and roaring, it tore through the valley, swollen with 3 days of rain and a winter's worth of melted snow. Entire trees, ancient and mighty, cracked like twigs and vanished into the brown, churning chaos. Fence posts were plucked from the earth like toothpicks. The sound of it, a deep, guttural roar, reached all the way to the edge of Billings. John Carter's knuckles were bone white on the steering wheel of his old Ford F-150. The leather wrap was worn smooth from years of his grip, but today he felt like he was trying to hold on to the world itself. Beside him, his 9-year-old son Eli was pressed against the passenger door, his small face a mask of awe and terror. He stared out at the sheets of water hammering the windshield, trying to make sense of the world being washed away. John had been in firefights. He'd crouched in the sand of Afghanistan while mortar rounds split the night sky. He knew the sound of man-made fury. But this was different. This was the sound of nature itself coming to collect a debt. He slammed on the brakes, the old truck groaning in protest. They were at the edge of what used to be an intersection. Now it was just the angry edge of the flood. Water spilled over the hood, a greedy tongue tasting the metal, tugging at the tires with an immense invisible strength. An inch farther, and the beast would swallow them whole. "We'll wait it out here," he muttered. His voice was low, a rumble of calm in the storm, but it was forced. Eli pressed his hands flat against the dashboard, his wide brown eyes fixed on the chaos. Then he pointed, his small finger trembling. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar. "There's somebody out there." John squinted, following his son's gaze. At first, he saw nothing but debris. A log, a tire, a mess of broken branches all caught in the current's grip. It was a graveyard of familiar things. Then lightning cracked open the bruised purple sky, and in that flash of brilliant, jagged light, he saw her, clear as day, a woman, clinging for dear life to a half-submerged stop sign, maybe 20 yards out. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, her clothes. It was a business suit, he realized, a tailored, expensive suit, now torn and ruined by the current. She looked like she'd fallen out of another world and landed in their small town of denim and work boots. On the higher ground nearby, a crowd was gathering. Farmers, truck drivers, a few teenagers holding up their phones recording the destruction. They were shouting, pointing, but none of them dared to step into that water. They knew better. They knew the power of that current. It wasn't a place for heroes, it was a place to die. John's pulse hammered in his throat. A stranger, a risk, and his son, his only son, was sitting right here in the truck. But he saw her knuckles, bone white against the red steel of the sign. The water was climbing, inch by inch, relentless. Every second that passed, her grip was failing. "Stay in the truck, Eli." His tone was flat, final. It was the voice he'd used in the service, the voice that left no room for argument. Eli's lips parted to protest, but he'd learned that voice long ago. He swallowed the words, his fear for the woman warring with the fear his father's tone inspired. He just nodded, his young face clouded and tight. John shoved open the driver's side door. The water hit him like a physical blow. It was colder than ice, a shocking, brutal impact that rose instantly to his thighs. The force of it almost buckled his knees. He braced himself, leaning into the current as if it were a man he had to fight. Each step was a battle, his boots filled with water, turning into lead weights. Branches, garbage, even a child's toy chest slammed against his legs, trying to trip him, to pull him under. He kept his eyes locked on the woman. She lifted her head, and her eyes found his. He saw the raw terror there, the animal fear of a person about to drown. But there was something else, too. Something that made the hairs on his neck stand up. It looked like recognition. Was it just the wild hope of the dying, or did she know him? She tried to hold on, but her body was failing. The current sagged her lower, pulling her away from the sign, her fingers slipping. "Hold on!" John roared, his voice shredded by the wind and the din of the water. He took another step, the water surging up to his waist, threatening to sweep him off his feet. His thighs burned, his lungs ached from the cold and the strain. He lunged, his fingers locked around her wrist just as her grip failed completely. The current yanked them both sideways, slamming his shoulder hard against the steel post. A sharp, hot flare of pain shot through him, but he held on. It was pure instinct now, the Marine in him taking over, fighting for one last breath, one last inch of ground. Her body crashed into his. She was trembling violently, her soaked, expensive clothes plastered to his chest. He wrapped an arm around her waist, using the stop sign as an anchor. For one terrifying heartbeat, he feared his strength would give out, that the river would claim them both. 2 more pieces of debris for the storm. "Hang on, ma'am," he grunted, his voice a raw whisper against her ear. Then, a shout from the shore. Help was coming. 2 men from the crowd had finally moved. They'd formed a human chain, wading into the shallower edge of the flood. Another man joined them, then another. They inched toward him, their faces grim with effort. Together, they pulled, step by agonizing, painful step, until John and the stranger collapsed onto the blessed, solid asphalt. They lay there, coughing up muddy water, shivering uncontrollably. The crowd erupted in cheers, but John barely heard them. His chest heaved, his muscles quaked, and his soaked hair dripped into his eyes. Eli was there in an instant, wrapping a thick wool blanket from the truck around the woman's shoulders. She gasped, clawing at the fabric. But as paramedics began to push through the crowd, her terror returned, sharper and more focused than before. She grabbed John's arm, her grip shockingly strong. "No," she rasped, her eyes wide and wild. "No hospitals. Please, if they take me there, they'll find me." Her words cut through his exhaustion like a shard of glass. He frowned, studying her pale face, the manicured nails now broken and raw. This wasn't the fear of drowning. He'd seen that before. This was something deeper, older, sharper. This was the fear of being hunted. The sirens wailed, growing closer. Ambulance lights flashed red against the wet pavement, painting the scene in pulses of blood and warning. In that moment, John Carter made a decision. It was a choice that would shatter the quiet, careful peace he had built for himself and his son since coming home from Afghanistan. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear over the storm. "Can you walk?" She nodded faintly, her eyes darting around the crowd with a panicked energy, as if seeing enemies in every face. "Yes," she whispered. "Then you walk with me." He helped her to her feet, shielding her with his body as the first paramedics reached them. "She's all right," he said, his voice calm but firm. The tone of command, the one that had carried him through 2 tours, was still there. It left little room for argument. "Just shaken. I've got her." The paramedic hesitated, then nodded, turning his attention to another person who had slipped on the wet ground. The woman leaned into him, her body still racked with shivers. As he guided her toward his pickup, her boots squelching on the waterlogged asphalt, she whispered her name against the roar of the sirens and the rain. Catherine. Catherine Moore. Behind them, Eli clutched the edge of the blanket, watching everything with eyes that were far too old for his 9 years. He sensed it. The shift in his father's stance, the weight of the choice that had just been made. He knew, with the certainty of a child who has already seen too much, that their lives were about to change. John didn't know what kind of storm he had just pulled from the flood, but the cold unease prickling the back of his neck told him it was only the beginning. As the Ford's old engine rumbled to life and they pulled away from the flashing lights, Catherine stared out the rain-streaked window, her jaw tight. John asked the question that was hanging in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. "Who are you running from?" She didn't answer right away. She just kept staring into the gray, watery world outside. Her silence was an answer in itself. It filled the cab, heavier than the smell of wet wool and motor oil. And in that silence, John Carter knew that whatever was coming for Catherine Moore would not be washed away as easily as a spring flood. It would follow them, and it would try to drown them all. John's pickup rattled over the gravel road leading to his property, the headlights cutting a weak path through the last of the rain. The cab was thick with the smell of the flood. Wet clothes, mud, and a sharp, metallic tang of fear. The heater whined, straining to push a meager warmth into the cold air. Catherine sat pressed against the passenger door, as far from him as she could get. Her expensive suit was a ruin, clinging to her frame. Her eyes, shadowed and deep, darted at every passing light, every flicker in the darkness, as if each one was a hunter closing in. Eli was in the middle, a small, silent figure wrapped in a wool blanket. He wasn't looking at the road. He was watching her, his young face a study in sharp, unnerving curiosity. He knew this woman was trouble. He just didn't know what kind. By the time they pulled into the yard, the storm had finally broken, softening to a cold, persistent drizzle. The house wasn't much. Just a weathered log structure John had built with his own 2 hands after he came back. A place to be quiet. A place to forget. The front porch sagged a little on one end, and the detached workshop squatted behind it like a tired, loyal dog. The lights inside cast a dim, golden glow against the gloom, a beacon of a peace that was about to be shattered. "Come on," John said quietly, his voice gruff. He opened her door, and the smell of wet pine filled the cab. He guided her inside, his muddy boots leaving dark streaks on the clean wooden floor. The house smelled of cedar and varnish, the honest smells of his work, of the life he'd tried to build. Eli hurried ahead, a small man of the house, switching on lamps, his movements jerky and anxious. Catherine sank onto the worn leather couch, her body still trembling. Though whether from cold or fear, John couldn't tell. He went to a wooden chest in the corner, one he hadn't opened in years. He pulled out a folded flannel shirt and a pair of gray sweatpants. "They belong to my wife," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. They should fit close enough. Her gaze lingered on his face, catching the flicker of pain behind the words. She accepted the clothes with hands that still shook. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. While she changed in the small bathroom, John moved around the kitchen with the steady, practiced efficiency of a man who had lived alone for a long time. He put a kettle on the stove, the scrape of metal on the grate loud in the quiet house. Eli perched on a stool at the counter, his small legs swinging. "Dad," he whispered, his voice urgent, "why doesn't she want the hospital? Is she in trouble with the police?" "Don't know yet, son," John murmured, but the weight in his tone said he had his guesses. Men who ran from hospitals were usually hiding from the law, or from people who made their own laws. But a woman in a business suit, with fear like that in her eyes. That was a different kind of trouble altogether. That was the kind of trouble that had long, dangerous roots. The bathroom door creaked open. Catherine emerged. The borrowed clothes were too big for her, the sleeves of the flannel rolled up at her wrists. Her hair was towel-dried but still damp, clinging to her neck. Without the armor of her expensive suit, she looked smaller, more fragile, stripped down to the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Before John could say a word, a knock sounded at the door. 3 sharp, deliberate raps. John tensed instantly. His body went rigid, his hand moving instinctively toward the edge of the counter where he kept his revolver. Eli froze on his stool, his eyes darting from the door to his father's face. The world seemed to shrink to the space of that small living room, the sound of the rain dripping from the eaves suddenly deafening. Then a voice called out, muffled by the wood but familiar. "John? It's just me." John let out a slow, controlled breath and opened the door. Ruth Delgado stepped inside, shaking the rain from her coat. She was the town's night shift nurse, a woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that had earned her the respect of every roughneck and farmer in the county. Her dark hair was pulled back under a wool cap, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She carried a canvas bag filled with medical supplies. She stopped short when her eyes landed on Catherine, who was huddled on the couch. Ruth's eyebrows arched. "What in God's name is this, John?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in Catherine's borrowed clothes, her pale face, the tension in the room. "Pulled her out of the flood," John replied, his voice even. "She didn't want the hospital." Ruth set her bag down with a thump, the sound echoing John's own suspicions. Her expression sharpened. "Everyone goes to the hospital after nearly drowning, and you know it. Hypothermia, secondary drowning. You of all people should know better." "I know what I saw," he said, his voice steady, meeting her gaze. "She begged me not to take her. There's something else going on here, Ruth." Ruth studied Catherine for a long, silent moment, her nurse's eyes assessing, missing nothing. Then she knelt beside the couch, her professionalism taking over. She checked Catherine's pulse, her breathing, and shone a small flashlight into her eyes. "You're lucky you're not in a morgue," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "But you need rest, and you need to be watched." "I'll be fine," Catherine insisted, her voice thin but stubborn. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders as if it could protect her. Ruth glanced at John, a silent conversation passing between them. It was a look built on years of shared, small-town life, of patching up his cuts from the workshop and her quiet presence after his wife had passed. There was trust there, but there was also a warning in her eyes. "You're playing with fire." When Ruth finally packed up her bag to leave, the house felt quieter, emptier. Eli had fallen asleep on the couch, curled up beneath the flannel blanket, finally succumbing to the exhaustion of the day. The storm had passed, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. John poured 2 mugs of steaming tea and set one on the small table in front of Catherine. She cupped the warm ceramic with both hands, the steam rising to her pale face. For a long time she just stared into the mug, as if weighing the danger of every word she was about to speak. Finally she looked up, and her eyes were dark with a truth he was not prepared for. "My name is Catherine Moore," she said, her voice low and steady now. "I am, or I was, the chief financial officer for Blackwell Defense." She said the name of the company like it was poison on her tongue. John leaned back, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The name was familiar. Too familiar. Blackwell Defense, the defense contractors out of D.C. The ones with friends in high places and contracts worth billions. "I've heard of them," he said, his voice rough. She gave a short, bitter nod. "On paper, we provide research. State-of-the-art equipment for national security, a shield for the good guys." She paused, her gaze dropping back to her mug. "But that's not what we do. Not really. Beneath the official books, there's another set of ledgers. We funnel money, we move weapons off the books, we hide numbers that would put men in prison for life. The world thinks we build shields. In truth, we sell the swords." The kettle on the stove began to whistle softly, a forgotten sound from a world that no longer existed. John's eyes narrowed. His mind was tumbling backward, through years and across an ocean, back to the sand and smoke of Afghanistan. Back to men he'd called brothers, men who had fallen under a hail of gunfire from weapons that were too new, too sophisticated to be in enemy hands. "Those weapons," he said, his voice a low growl. "Where did they end up?" Her silence was all the confirmation he needed. The cold knot in his stomach turned to ice. "Why are you telling me this?" Her hand started to shake again, so badly that tea sloshed over the rim of her mug and onto her hand. She didn't seem to notice. Because they want me dead." The words hung in the quiet room, stark and terrible. "I kept records," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The real records. Paper ledgers, microfilm copies, encrypted backup discs. My partner, the one who helped me, he was killed last month. They called it a car accident, a tragic drunk driving incident. But it wasn't. I was next on the list." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "The flood tonight, that wasn't fate, John. My car was forced off the road. It was convenient. Who would ask questions about another victim of a natural disaster?" John's stomach clenched. A woman running from professional killers, a woman carrying secrets that reached into the dark heart of the government and the military he had served. And she was sitting in his living room, wearing his dead wife's clothes, while his son slept 10 feet away. "You should have gone to the authorities," he said, the words sounding hollow even to him. She let out a laugh, but it was a sharp, broken sound, devoid of any humor. "The authorities? John, Blackwell owns half of them. Local police, state contacts, even federal agents. I tried. I reached out to a contact in the bureau. The next day he was reassigned. Every door I knocked on was slammed in my face. There is no one to go to." John rubbed a calloused hand over his face, a headache beginning to throb in his temples. All he had wanted was peace, a quiet job, a safe roof over Eli's head. And now, the war he thought he'd left behind had followed him home and knocked on his door. He looked at her, at the raw desperation in her eyes, but also at the hard glint of determination beneath it. She was a fighter. She had survived. "Why didn't you just disappear?" he asked. "Run to Mexico, change your name." Her eyes lifted to meet his, and what he saw in them made his breath catch in his throat. "Because I can't carry this alone anymore," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "And because men like your friends, the men you served with, your brothers, they deserve to be avenged." The words landed like a punch to the gut. She knew. Somehow she knew about his past. About the fire he had tried so hard to bury beneath the quiet life he'd built. Eli stirred in his sleep, a soft, innocent sound that pierced the heavy silence. John turned his head, watching his son's small chest rise and fall. He had sworn an oath to himself, to the memory of his wife, that he would never drag that boy into the shadows. He would never let the violence of his past touch his son's future. But the storm he'd pulled from the river was just beginning, and in Catherine Moore's trembling hands, he sensed she held the kind of truth that could burn an entire empire to ash, and him, and his son, right along with it. The rain had eased by morning, leaving the world slick and gray. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and diesel fumes. John Carter stood at his kitchen window, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand, staring out at the muddy yard where his old Ford sat like a wounded animal. His jaw was tight, his arms folded across his chest. He hadn't slept. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind had sounded like an approaching footstep. Behind him, Catherine moved quietly, a ghost in his late wife's flannel shirt. She had found one of Eli's shoelaces and used it to tie back her hair. She kept glancing at the boy who was sitting at the small kitchen table. He had a box of cereal in front of him, and he was pretending to read the back, but his shoulders were rigid. He was listening to every unspoken word, every ounce of tension in the room. "You can't stay here," John said at last, his voice low and certain. He didn't turn from the window. Catherine set down the mug she'd been holding, her fingers pale from gripping it too hard. "I know. They'll be looking for me. My car will be found in the river. When my body isn't in it, they'll start searching. If they tracked me this far, they'll track me here." John finally turned to face her, his gaze sharp enough to cut. "And if they track you here, they find my boy." He looked at Eli. The boy was crunching his cereal loudly, a little too loudly, but he didn't look up. He knew this was about him. He was the weak point. He was the leverage. "I never meant to drag you into this," Catherine said, her voice cracking with the strain. "But last night, you didn't just save my life. You made a choice. That means you're already in it." The simple, brutal truth of her words landed between them with a heavy thud. He was in it. The moment he'd pulled her from the water, he had picked a side. John drew a slow breath, the cold coffee forgotten. "There's a place, up in the crazy mountains. A hunting cabin I built with a buddy of mine years ago, back when we were still trying to hunt our ghosts out of the timber." He looked her dead in the eye. "Nobody knows it's there but me. No roads on any map lead to it. We'll go tonight, under the cover of darkness." Eli looked up then, his spoon poised in midair. "The hunting cabin?" His eyes flickered, a strange mix of childhood excitement and a new adult fear. He remembered the cabin, long summer weekends spent there, the smell of pine smoke, the deep, profound silence broken only by the call of an elk at dusk. It was their safe place, but now it was a hiding place. Catherine hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "If you take me there, you're risking everything for me." "I'm not arguing about this," John cut in, his tone pure iron. "If they're after you, they will come here. My boy has no chance in a place like this. It's a fishbowl. Up there, I know the land. I know every rock and every tree. We'll stand a chance. It's the only one we've got." Catherine pressed her lips into a thin, tight line, then gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. And then the knock on the door came. It was sharp, loud, and unexpected. Eli froze, his spoon clattering into his bowl. John's hand dropped instinctively to the revolver he'd left on the counter. He moved to the door, silent as a shadow, and pressed his ear against the wood, listening. "John, it's Ruth," a voice called from outside. It was hushed, urgent. "Open up." John opened the door cautiously, just a crack. Ruth Delgado slipped inside, her raincoat dripping onto the floor. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks, and her eyes held a new, deeper kind of fear. It wasn't the professional concern of a nurse anymore. It was personal. "I heard talk at the diner this morning," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Strangers, 2 of them, in a black sedan with government plates. They were asking questions, asking about a woman in a business suit who was pulled out of the flood last night." She took a breath, her eyes shifting to Catherine, who had gone deathly pale. "They had photos, John. Not just of her car. They're moving fast. And I don't think they're law enforcement." "Not the kind that helps people." Catherine's knuckles were white against the arm of the couch. She looked like she might shatter. Ruth stepped closer, lowering her voice even further. "One of them leaned on Sheriff Thompson. I saw it myself through the window of his office. The man looked like he'd seen a ghost. Thompson just brushed it off, said he hadn't heard anything. But he was scared, John. I know him. He was terrified." John cursed under his breath. "It's starting already. They're closing the net." Ruth turned her fierce gaze back to him. "You're planning on hiding her here, aren't you? Because that won't hold for an hour. Not in Billings. These men aren't asking nicely." John met her eyes. He didn't need to explain. "The cabin," he said simply. Ruth's brow furrowed in protest. "You can't be serious. You can't drag Eli up there into the middle of this." "He's already in the middle of it," John shot back, his voice raw. He took a step closer to her, his voice softening, becoming almost a plea. "Ruth, if I leave him here, he's a target. They'll find him. They'll use him. If I take him with me, I can protect him. I can keep my eyes on him." Ruth's eyes flickered with a complex storm of emotions. Anger, fear, and then something else, a deep, painful resolve. "Then I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm. "You'll need an extra pair of hands if things go south, and if someone gets hurt, you'll need me. I'm not letting you go up there alone with that boy." John studied her, seeing the unyielding set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. He didn't want to drag her deeper into this mess, but he knew arguing would be a waste of the precious little time they had left. He gave a single curt nod. By late afternoon, the Carter property looked normal. The old pickup was parked in the yard, the curtains were drawn. Nothing to see here. But inside, it was a different story. John was packing supplies with the quiet, deadly precision of a soldier preparing for a mission. Canned goods, blankets, a kerosene lantern, every box of ammunition he owned. Catherine gathered her precious evidence, the paper ledgers and the bundle of microfilm rolls, from the waterproof bag she'd somehow managed to keep with her through the flood. Ruth went through her medical kit, repackaging it, stuffing bandages, sutures, and antibiotics into smaller, more portable pouches. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the bruised clouds in shades of orange and purple, John loaded everything into the bed of the Ford, covering it all with a heavy canvas tarp. He caught Eli's anxious eyes watching him from the doorway. "You remember how to be quiet when we're out there?" he asked softly. Eli nodded quickly, his small face serious. "Like when we're hunting." "Exactly like that." They drove north as dusk settled, the truck's engine growling a low protest as it climbed the back roads. The headlights were swallowed by the thickening darkness. Eli sat between Ruth and Catherine in the cramped cab, clutching a flashlight like a talisman. John kept his eyes on the winding road, but his senses were stretched thin, listening, watching for any sign of pursuit. For hours, they wound deeper and deeper into the mountains. The pines closed in around them, their dark shapes like silent sentinels. The air grew cold and sharp with altitude. At last, John pulled off the main road and onto a dirt path so narrow and overgrown it was barely passable. Branches scraped and screeched against the sides of the truck as he drove higher, the world narrowing into a tunnel of dark forest. They reached the cabin well past midnight. It was a squat, solid log structure tucked into a thick stand of trees, its smoke-stained chimney leaning just slightly but sturdy. The place smelled of cold cedar and dust when John swung the heavy door open, the light from his lantern spilling inside. Eli darted in first, a flicker of memory and comfort on his face as he saw the familiar bunks and the old stone fireplace. Catherine followed slowly, her eyes scanning the rough-hewn beams, the dusty hunting trophies on the wall, the single window with its heavy wooden shutter bolted tight. Ruth moved with practiced efficiency, lighting the lamps John had packed, checking the dark corners of the small room. "This will hold," John said, setting his rifle against the wall. "For now." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. Catherine had pulled something from her damp bag. It was the coat she'd been wearing the night of the flood. She held it up in the flickering lamplight, her eyes widening in horror. Sewn into the lining, almost invisible, was a small, flat device. A faint green light blinked once, twice. It was a transmitter. "They already marked me," she whispered, her voice choked with a new, suffocating wave of fear. "They didn't just try to kill me. They tagged me, like an animal." Her eyes lifted to meet John's. "They know," she said, the words barely a breath. "They know exactly where we are." John's stomach sank like a stone. The cabin, the forest, the isolation. It was all an illusion. It wouldn't buy them days. It might not even buy them hours. The hunters were already on their trail. And as the wind rattled the wooden shutter, the deep silence of the mountains pressed in around them. No longer a comfort, but a warning. The trap was closing. The mountain cabin was a small island of flickering light in an ocean of darkness. The only sounds were the hiss and snap of dry pine in the hearth and the low moan of the wind outside. Shadows danced across the log walls, twisting the dusty antlers above the fireplace into the shape of skeletal hands reaching down. John Carter sat at the small wooden table, his revolver disassembled before him. He cleaned each piece with a slow, deliberate precision, the soft clicks of metal on metal, a small, sharp counterpoint to the fire's crackle. But he wasn't just cleaning his weapon, he was listening. His ears were strained, filtering the sounds of the night, waiting for the one sound that didn't belong. Catherine sat by the single-shuttered window as if she could see through the wood. The microfilm rolls and water-stained ledgers were laid out on the table beside her, a testament to the life she had sacrificed. Her eyes kept darting toward the dark forest outside, as if she expected to see men with rifles emerge from the trees. Her hands still shook as she sorted through the papers, but her face had hardened. The trembling victim he'd pulled from the flood was gone, replaced by someone carrying secrets heavy enough to crush nations. Ruth worked by the unsteady light of a kerosene lamp, organizing her medical supplies into neat, clinical rows on a rough wooden shelf. She moved with a quiet purpose, but every so often she would stop and look at John. An unspoken question lingered in her eyes. She had followed him up here without hesitation, but he knew what she was thinking. Dragging Eli into this kind of danger was a form of madness. The boy himself was curled on one of the bunks, a thick wool blanket tucked up to his chin. His wide, dark eyes were open, reflecting the firelight. He hadn't said much since Catherine had found the transmitter. He didn't need an explanation. He understood. Someone was hunting them, and they were close. John reassembled the revolver, the cylinder snapping into place with a final, satisfying click. He slid the weapon into the worn leather holster at his side, then stood, his shadow looming large on the wall behind him. His voice was low and calm, but it cut through the tense silence. "We can't stay long. That transmitter on her coat. They've had a signal since she hit the water. It's only a matter of time before they zero in on this location." Catherine's voice cracked in the quiet. "I didn't even know it was there. I swear to you, John." He held up a hand, cutting her off. "No one's blaming you, but it means we have to move, now, before they can surround us." He glanced at his son, then back at the two women. "They'll come at night. They prefer the dark. It's easier to make bodies disappear." The fire popped sharply, as if in agreement. Ruth crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "And where exactly are you planning on going? In the middle of the night, with a child, a woman they want dead, and me, carrying nothing but a nurse's kit." "The forest," John answered simply. His voice carried the quiet, unshakable authority of a man who had lived and fought in places far worse than this. "They might have technology, but they don't know this land. I do. We move before dawn. If they catch up, I'll draw them off." "No." The small voice broke the tension like a stone through glass. Eli pushed himself upright on the bunk, the blanket pooling around his waist. His eyes locked on his father's, fierce and frightened all at once. "You're not leaving me again." The words hit John with the force of a physical blow. His chest tightened. The boy remembered. Of course he remembered. The long, silent months after his mother died, when John had drowned himself in work and grief, leaving Eli to navigate his own sorrow alone. He crouched beside the bunk, resting a large, calloused hand on his son's small shoulder. "I won't leave you, Eli, not this time. But I need you to listen to me. Every sound, every step. You do exactly what I say, when I say it. Can you do that for me?" Eli nodded, his lower lip trembling, though tears glimmered at the corners of his eyes. Catherine had risen from the table, clutching the bundle of evidence to her chest as if it were a shield. "If they catch me, you'll all die for nothing. Maybe I should just give myself up." "You're not going anywhere alone," John cut her off, his voice sharp, final. "Whatever is in those papers, it's bigger than you. It's bigger than me. They want to silence you because if that truth comes out, it burns their whole world down. That means you live, no matter what. Do you understand me?" For a long moment, her eyes searched his, as if trying to decide if she could truly trust this grim, quiet man who had already lost so much. Finally, she gave a single, resolute nod. The night stretched on, each minute crawling by with agonizing slowness. They packed by lamplight, stuffing food into canvas bags, filling canteens from a barrel of rainwater outside, trimming the wicks on the lanterns low. Ruth tucked syringes and packets of bandages into the deep pockets of her coat, her hands steady despite the frantic beating of her own heart. It was close to midnight when John froze. He was standing by the door, and his head turned sharply toward the shuttered window. He lifted a single finger to his lips, demanding silence. Everyone in the room stilled. The air grew thick, heavy. At first, there was nothing but the sigh of the wind through the pines. Then he heard it, faint but distinct. The crunch of tires on gravel far down the mountain path. Not one vehicle, two, maybe three. The engines were humming low and their headlights were off. Whoever was coming didn't want to be seen. "They're here," John whispered. The words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Ruth's grip tightened on the strap of her medical bag. Eli scrambled off the bunk and clutched his father's sleeve, his small body trembling. John moved quickly, blowing out the lantern, plunging the room into near darkness. Only the faint, dying glow of the fire remained, painting the walls in trembling shades of gold and black. He reached for his rifle, leaning it against the doorframe, checking the chamber by feel alone. Through the thin wood of the cabin walls, voices drifted up to them, low, hushed, methodical. The sounds of professional men spreading out, their boots crunching on dry pine needles, the quiet, deadly click of a rifle bolt sliding into place. John's mind raced. There were too many of them. They would sweep the area, surround the cabin, torch it if they had to. He had to get his people out. Now. Before the noose tightened completely. He turned to Catherine and Ruth, his face a grim mask in the gloom. "We move now. Out the back window, straight into the timber. Stay low, and keep your eyes on me. If you hear shooting, you don't look back. You don't stop. You just run. Do you understand?" His voice was iron, unyielding. "What about you?" Ruth demanded in a harsh, desperate whisper. "I'll be right behind you," he lied. He lifted Eli through the small back window first, lowering him gently onto the damp ground outside. Catherine passed the precious bundle of papers through, then scrambled out herself, her movements clumsy with fear. Ruth followed, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her nurse's bag slung tight over her shoulder. John waited a precious second longer, listening. The footsteps were on the front porch now. He could hear the creak of the old wood. He slipped through the window after them, crouching low in the deep shadows. The forest swallowed them whole. The darkness under the pines was absolute, a black, silent world. John guided them down a narrow deer trail he knew by heart, his hand a steady, reassuring weight on Eli's shoulder. Every one of his senses was screaming, straining for any sound of movement behind them. Then it came. The cabin door crashed open, the sound echoing through the quiet woods. Voices shouted. Boots pounded on the wooden floor inside. The sounds of a frantic search, a curse, the scrape of the table being overturned. John didn't stop moving. He didn't look back. He pushed them deeper and deeper into the woods, every step carrying them farther from the trap. But the cold night air carried sound with a terrible clarity. Soon the inevitable cry came from behind them. "Tracks! They went this way! They're heading west!" He heard the click of gunmetal, the angry, deep-throated barks of dogs. Then beams from powerful flashlights stabbed through the trees, cutting the darkness into nervous dancing pieces. John tightened his grip on Eli's shoulder. "Run," he whispered, his voice low and fierce. And as they fled into the black timber, hunted by men who would kill without hesitation, and dogs that would not tire, he knew the fight was no longer about keeping Catherine's secrets safe. It was about keeping his son alive long enough to see the dawn. The night gave way to a bruised purple dawn. John guided the weary, stumbling group along forgotten back roads that threaded through the desolate valleys. The old Ford coughed and sputtered with every mile, loaded heavy with supplies and the heavier weight of their fear. In the front of the cab, Eli had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, his head leaning against Ruth's side. Catherine sat in the back, silent and rigid, clutching the bundle of ledgers and microfilm as if her grip alone could keep the world from falling apart. John's eyes never left the rearview mirror. He was a man running on pure adrenaline and bitter coffee. Twice he thought he saw the distant glint of headlights cresting a ridge behind them, but both times they vanished before he could be certain. It didn't matter. The paranoia was a tool now, a weapon. He trusted it more than he trusted comfort. Comfort got men killed. By mid-morning, they rolled into Cooperville. It wasn't so much a town as a place the road passed through. A handful of dusty streets, a grain elevator that leaned slightly to the north, and a general sense of being forgotten by time. To anyone else, it was a dot on a map, not even worth a second glance. For John, it was the place where one of the few men on earth he still trusted had chosen to disappear. He pulled the truck up beside a weathered false front store with a hand-painted sign that read, Dalton's General Goods. The building sagged with age, but a faint welcoming light glowed from within. "Stay here," John told the women and Eli, his voice low. "Don't get out for any reason." He stepped out of the truck, the revolver a solid, comforting weight snug against his hip, and pushed through the creaking screen door. The place smelled of dust, strong coffee, and motor oil. The shelves were crammed with a strange assortment of goods, canned beans and new rope, boxes of ammunition and spare engine parts, the sort of odds and ends that only men who had lived hard lives knew how to value. Behind the counter, a man in his late 50s looked up from a thick ledger. Frank Dalton was a man built on a solid frame of muscle that had gone a little soft around the edges. His hair was more silver than black now, but his eyes were still sharp. They were the eyes of a soldier who had seen too much and remembered it all. "John Carter," Frank said, a slow, genuine grin spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought you'd buried yourself for good up in Billings." "Good to see you too, Frank," John answered, but his voice was tight, all business. He leaned on the counter, lowering his tone. "I don't have time for catching up. I need a vehicle, something clean, something that won't be traced, and I need it yesterday." Frank's grin faded. He studied John's face for a long, quiet beat, his sharp eyes taking in the exhaustion, the tension, the grim set of his jaw. Then his gaze flickered past John to the truck parked outside, where he could see the shadowy outlines of people in the cab. "You got company?" "Trouble," John confirmed, "the kind that doesn't knock." Frank sighed, a long, weary sound, and rubbed a hand over his jaw. "You always did have a knack for bringing a storm with you, son." He turned and disappeared through a door behind the counter. When he returned, he was carrying a ring of keys. "Old delivery truck out back," he said, tossing them on the counter. "Doesn't look like much, but the engine is solid. It'll run forever. You'll need to ditch your Ford. Too many folks around here know it's yours." John nodded, a fraction of the tension in his shoulders easing. "I appreciate it, Frank." Frank placed the keys on the counter, but his hand lingered on them. His voice dropped even lower. "Word travels, John. Even out here. There's been talk on the radio. Men came through here a few hours ago. Dangerous men, asking about a woman. A woman pulled out of the flood up near Billings." He looked John dead in the eye. "You sure you want to be on the same road as her?" John's jaw tightened. "She didn't choose this road, Frank, but she's got something they'll kill for, and that means they won't stop until she's in the ground. I'm not handing her over." Frank's eyes flickered with something unreadable, respect, maybe, or just the sad recognition of a battle that couldn't be won. But he didn't argue. "All right," he said. There's a CB radio in the truck. Range is limited, but if you get in a bind and need to shout for help, you'll have a line." He bent down, lifted a heavy cardboard box, and set it on the counter with a thud. Inside were boxes of 30-06 rounds, 2 powerful flashlights, and a battered laminated field map of the Western Territories. "Figured you'll need these more than I do," he said gruffly. John clasped his old friend's shoulder. "I owe you, Frank." "Just don't die," Frank said, his voice rough with an emotion he wouldn't name. "That'll make us even." John went back to the truck and ushered the others out. They followed him around back, where a rusted, nondescript delivery truck sat half-hidden behind a row of hay bales. It was perfect, anonymous, forgettable. He worked fast, transferring their supplies from the Ford while Ruth checked on Eli and Catherine scanned the empty street with nervous, haunted eyes. As John slammed the truck's heavy back door shut, a movement across the street caught his eye. 2 men, leaning against a dark sedan. They were pretending to smoke, their posture casual, but their eyes were locked on the alley. On them. One of them raised a hand to his mouth, speaking quietly into something concealed in his palm. John's blood went cold. They'd been found. "Get in the truck," he hissed, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now!" Catherine froze, her eyes wide with confusion. "What is it?" "Eyes!" John snarled. "We've got eyes on us!" Ruth didn't hesitate. She shoved Eli into the cab and scrambled in after him. John leaped into the driver's seat and fired up the engine. The old delivery truck coughed, rattled, then roared to life with a belch of black smoke. Across the street, the 2 men straightened up, their casual postures vanishing. One of them reached under his coat. "Down!" John barked, slamming the gear shift forward. The truck lurched out of the alley, its wheels spitting gravel. A shot cracked through the quiet morning air. The rear glass of the cab exploded inward. Eli screamed as shards of safety glass rained down around them. John yanked the wheel hard, barreling out onto the main street. The sleepy town of Cooperville erupted into chaos. Locals dove for cover behind parked cars. Shouts echoed through the street as the dark sedan peeled away from the curb, its tires smoking in pursuit. "Frank!" Ruth shouted, pointing back at the store. The old storekeeper had stepped out onto his front porch, a pump-action shotgun in his hands. He fired twice at the sedan. Buckshot sparked off the car's reinforced windshield, forcing the driver to duck. Frank's voice, a gravelly roar, carried across the street. "Go, John! Get out of here! They'll be on you no matter what!" John didn't need to be told twice. He sped toward the highway, Catherine clutching Eli close in the back, Ruth bracing herself against the dashboard. The delivery truck rattled and shook, protesting the speed, but it held together. In the mirror, he saw the sedan closing the distance, and then, from the opposite end of town, another vehicle joined the chase. 2 tails. Too fast. Too organized. Catherine's voice shook. "They know. They always know where we are." "They've always been 1 step behind," John said, his eyes locked on the road, his mind racing, calculating. "Now we make them chase us where they don't want to go." The map Frank had given him was seared into his memory. North was open prairie, a death trap. East was the river. But west led into the foothills. Narrow switchbacks, treacherous drop-offs, and old mining roads that could break a man who didn't know them. He jerked the wheel, sending the truck careening west. The sedan closed in, its heavy bumper almost kissing their tailgate. Eli cried out, and Ruth held him tighter. Catherine pressed her forehead against the window, whispering a prayer or a curse. John couldn't tell which. Then came the sound that changed everything, the piercing shriek of a train horn. Ahead of them, the railway crossing lights began to flash their frantic red warning. The barrier arm was beginning to lower. "John!" Ruth's voice was a knife of pure panic. He floored it. The old engine screamed in protest. The whole truck rattled so hard the steering wheel nearly jumped from his hands. The train barreled into view from the right, a monstrous wall of steel and thunder, moving impossibly fast. The delivery truck roared across the tracks just as the locomotive thundered past, its horn blasting a deafening warning. The world was metal shrieking against metal, the violent rip of displaced air tearing at the cab. Catherine screamed. Eli's eyes went wide with a terror so pure it was silent. Ruth clutched them both, her own face pale as a sheet. Behind them, the sedan braked too late. It swerved hard, tires squealing on the pavement. Sparks flew as it skidded sideways, missing the train by inches but slamming into the descending barrier arm. On the other side of the crossing, John eased the truck just enough to keep it steady, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The sound of the train swallowed the world, a curtain of noise and steel, cutting them off from their pursuers. For now. He let out a hard, ragged breath, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his fingers ached. "We're not safe," he said, his voice grim. "Not yet. Not until we get this evidence into the right hands." Catherine lifted her face, her expression pale but fierce. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with a new, hard resolve. "Then we go to Denver," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I have a contact there, a reporter, Sophia Chen. She'll meet us. She'll know how to make this count." John nodded, his eyes on the long, empty road ahead. The train's thunder faded behind them, but he knew it wouldn't hold their enemies for long. They had only bought themselves a little more time, and in the west, the mountains waited, promising both refuge and danger in equal measure. The old delivery truck rattled down the empty highway, its engine groaning in protest as it climbed the rising grade of the foothills. The train tracks and the town of Cooperville were miles behind them now, but John Carter knew the reprieve was temporary. Men like the ones chasing them didn't give up after one close call. They regrouped, they called for reinforcements, and they came back harder the next time. Inside the cab, the silence was thick and heavy, broken only by the groan of the truck's engine and the occasional nervous rattle of supplies in the back. Eli sat pressed between Ruth and Catherine, his head resting on Ruth's arm. His eyes were half closed, but his small body was still tense, as if he were listening for danger even in his sleep. Ruth glanced at John, her brow furrowed with a worry that was sharp as a blade. "He can't keep living like this, John. On the run, he's a child." "He's my son," John said, his voice even, his eyes fixed on the twisting road ahead. "And he'll live as long as I can keep him close to me." "That's not the same as keeping him safe," she shot back, her voice low but fierce. "Dragging him through shootouts, running from God knows who. This is no life for him." John's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't thought about that every second since I pulled her out of that river? If I leave him behind, he becomes a hostage. They'll use him against me, or worse. You think I want this for him?" Ruth fell silent, but the anger in her eyes didn't fade. It was an anger born of fear for the boy she had helped raise. Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clutching the bundle of evidence tighter in her lap. The weight of her secrets was a physical burden, not just on her, but on everyone in this truck. "They won't stop," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Not until this is out in the open. These papers, this proof. It's the only way any of this ends. Once Sophia Chen has it, once she publishes the story, I stop being a target. I become a liability they can't afford to touch anymore." John's jaw flexed. "Or they make sure the story never sees the light of day by killing her and everyone connected to her. Don't put all your faith in ink and paper. Men like these don't care about the news." Catherine looked down at the bundle, her voice low and desperate. "It's not faith. It's the only card I have left to play." The truck groaned as it climbed a winding pass. Patches of dirty snow still clung to the shoulders of the road, remnants of a long winter. The mountains loomed higher on either side, their jagged peaks cutting into the pale, empty sky. John's instincts began to prickle. The back of his neck tingled. High ground, open road, perfect for an ambush. He eased his foot off the gas, his eyes scanning the dense tree line above them. "Something wrong?" Ruth asked, sensing the subtle change in his posture. "Too quiet," he muttered. "Too open." The words were barely out of his mouth when headlights flashed in the rearview mirror. Not one set, but two. Two dark vehicles, cresting the hill behind them, moving fast. Catherine stiffened. "They found us again." John's mind raced. The delivery truck was a workhorse, sturdy and reliable, but it wasn't built for speed. If he stayed on this open highway, they'd be boxed in within minutes. A sitting duck. Then he saw it. A narrow dirt road, barely more than a trail, cutting off to the left and disappearing into the dense timber. An old logging road, probably not used in decades. Without a moment's hesitation, he yanked the wheel. Gravel and dirt spit from under the tires as the truck lurched off the pavement and onto the rough path. Eli jolted awake with a startled cry. Ruth pulled him close as the truck bounced violently over deep ruts and half-buried rocks. Branches screeched against the metal sides, and a shower of pine needles rained down from the canopy above. Behind them, the pursuers followed without slowing, their powerful engines snarling, their tires grinding through the mud and debris. "Hold on!" John growled, wrestling with the wheel. He drove deeper into the forest, weaving between ancient trees, his hands sure and steady. He knew this kind of terrain. He had trained in it, fought in it. He knew how to use it as a weapon. And he knew his pursuers in their city sedans did not. A sharp bend in the trail revealed a creek, swollen and brown with meltwater. It was too wide to be safe. John didn't slow down. He gunned the engine, and the truck plunged into the rushing water. A wave of icy brown splashed over the hood, and the engine coughed, sputtering for a terrifying second before catching again. On the other side, he veered sharply to the right, behind a thick stand of firs, and killed the headlights. "Out!" he ordered, his voice like steel. "Now!" They scrambled from the cab, their boots sinking into the soft, wet earth. John grabbed Eli by the hand, his grip firm, and nodded to Ruth and Catherine. "Move! Quiet and fast!" They scrambled uphill, away from the trail, their breath fogging in the cold mountain air. Behind them, the roar of engines grew louder as the pursuing vehicles splashed into the creek. Powerful headlights speared through the trees, the beams slicing through the branches like searchlights from a prison yard. Ruth stumbled on a half-hidden root, nearly falling, but John caught her arm without breaking stride and pulled her along. Eli's small legs pumped furiously to keep up, but he never let go of his father's hand, his small face set in a look of grim determination. They crested a small ridge and crouched low behind a cluster of massive, moss-covered boulders. From there, they had a clear view of the scene below. The lights from the vehicles cast long, eerie shadows. Men were fanning out, their voices sharp, barking orders. And then came a sound that made John's blood run cold, the deep-throated, excited baying of hounds. "They've got dogs," Ruth whispered, a new edge of fear tightening her voice. John's mind raced. They couldn't outrun dogs in this terrain, not with a child, but they could mislead them. They could buy time. He stripped off his heavy jacket, the one that carried his scent most strongly. He shoved it into Ruth's hands. "Take this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Head west. Follow this ridgeline for half a mile, then circle downhill. Find the creek again, and drop the jacket in the water as far downstream as you can get. It'll buy us time." Ruth's eyes widened in disbelief. "You want me to split off? Alone? In the dark?" "You said you wanted to help," John said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "This is how you help." Catherine shook her head, her face pale in the gloom. "It's too dangerous. They'll find her. They'll kill her." John's gaze cut to hers, sharp as a blade. "We don't have the luxury of safe choices anymore. We buy time, or we all die here on this mountain. It's that simple." For a long moment, the two women stared at him, the sounds of the hunt growing louder from the valley below. The barking of the dogs was closer now, more frantic. Then Ruth squared her shoulders, her fear hardening into resolve. She slung her medical bag tighter. "Fine," she said, "but if I don't come back—" "You will," John said, cutting her off, his voice filled with a certainty he did not feel. "Because if you don't, I'll come for you." Ruth gave him one last look, a mixture of fear and trust, then nodded once. She slipped into the darkness, moving quickly and quietly, her form vanishing among the black trunks of the pines. Catherine looked at John, her eyes burning with accusation. "You just sent her to her death." "No," John said grimly, pulling Eli closer to the cold stone of the boulder. "I sent her to keep us alive." The barking grew louder, closer. The searchers were climbing the ridge now. John pulled Eli into the small space between his body and the rock, whispering into his ear, "Stay low. Don't make a sound. No matter what you hear." He gripped his rifle, the cold metal a familiar comfort, and settled into the deep shadows of the boulders. Catherine crouched beside him, clutching the evidence to her chest, her breath coming in shallow, trembling gasps, but she was steady. The cold night air smelled of damp earth, pine, and gun oil. The hunters were coming. John knew this fight was no longer about buying hours or days. It was about buying seconds. Seconds for Ruth's false trail to draw the dogs away. Seconds for him to lead his son and Catherine deeper into the unforgiving mountains. Below them, flashlights bobbed among the trees. Voices carried on the wind, sharp and confident, and John Carter steadied his rifle, the familiar weight of war settling over him again, like an old, unwelcome cloak. The drive into Denver was a long, tense crawl through an alien landscape of concrete and glass. The city's lights bloomed on the horizon, a sprawling, indifferent promise that felt like it could vanish at any moment. John Carter's hands were locked on the wheel of the battered delivery truck, his knuckles pale against the cracked plastic. Every time a pair of headlights flared in the rearview mirror, his body tensed, every muscle coiled, waiting for them to swerve, for the chase to begin again. But none did. Not yet. Catherine sat stiff and silent in the passenger seat, the precious bundle of ledgers and microfilm pressed tight to her chest. Exhaustion had carved deep shadows under her eyes, but the eyes themselves burned with a desperate, feverish fire. This was the end of the line, one way or another. In the back, Eli leaned against Ruth's shoulder, finally lost in a deep, twitching sleep. His breath was warm against her arm. Ruth stared out the side window, her face a pale, unreadable mask in the flashing city lights. She had made it back to them just before dawn, emerging from the forest like a ghost, silent and grim. She had thrown off the dogs, but John knew she carried the terror of that night in the dark woods like a stone in her chest. She hadn't spoken more than a few words since. "Where?" John asked quietly, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the hum of the engine. "The Denver Public Library," Catherine answered, her own voice thin and strained. "Sophia Chen. She said to meet her there. She said it would be safe, neutral territory, public." John didn't like it. In his experience, safe and public were rarely the same thing. Public just meant more witnesses, more chaos, more variables you couldn't control. But they were out of options. The evidence had to reach someone outside their desperate, shrinking circle. They couldn't keep running forever. They rolled into the city just after dawn, the streets slowly filling with the first wave of commuters, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and coffee. The old delivery truck felt like a relic from another time, a rusted ghost moving through the gleaming steel and glass of downtown. It drew stares from office workers in sharp suits, their faces smooth and untroubled. John parked 2 blocks from the library, tucking the truck between 2 larger commercial vans where it would be less conspicuous. He woke Eli gently, squeezing his small shoulder. "Stay close," he murmured. "No wandering." Eli rubbed the sleep from his eyes and nodded, his small hand gripping Ruth's as they stepped out into the chill morning air. Together, the 4 of them walked quickly, a strange, grim little family, toward the massive stone building that loomed ahead. Its grand columns rose like the pillars of a forgotten temple, a fortress of knowledge. Inside, the library smelled of old paper and floor polish. The silence was immense, a living thing broken only by the soft rustle of turning pages and the occasional dry cough. Catherine led them up to a quiet corner on the second floor, a small alcove between towering shelves of history books. She set the bundle on a heavy oak table, her hands trembling so badly she had to press them flat on the wood to still them. Moments later, a woman appeared. She was slender, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a press badge clipped to the lapel of her jacket. Sophia Chen. Her gaze swept over their small, battered group, lingering on Catherine's pale face, then on John's grim one, and finally on the small, silent boy hiding behind Ruth. "You made it," she said softly, her voice edged with a relief that was almost tangible. Catherine let out a long, shuddering breath. "I wasn't sure we would." Sophia slid into the chair across from her, her movements quick and efficient. "Do you have it?" Catherine pushed the bundle across the table. Sophia opened it carefully, her professional composure cracking as she scanned the ledgers, the spools of microfilm, the meticulously handwritten notes. Her eyes widened. "Good God," she whispered, looking up at Catherine with a new sense of awe and horror. This could bring down half the defense industry." "Or get you killed," John said flatly from where he stood watching the entrance to the aisle. Sophia's sharp gaze flicked to him. "That's why I'm not alone." From behind the towering shelves, another figure stepped into the alcove, a man in a dark, perfectly tailored suit. His hair was close-cropped, his eyes watchful and calm. He carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of federal law enforcement. "Agent Robert Collins," he said, his voice calm but firm. "FBI." John's muscles tightened instantly. He moved without thinking, a subtle shift of his body that placed him between the agent and Eli. "How do I know you're not one of them?" John asked, his voice a low growl. Collins didn't flinch. He met John's hostile stare without blinking. "Because I've been hunting Marcus Kane, Blackwell's head of security, for 3 years. And because your old squad mate, David Rollins, isn't dead. He's alive and he's in federal protection. I put him there myself." The name hit John like a hammer blow. David. He'd seen David go down in Afghanistan. He'd carried the man's memory for years. Another casualty of the ghost weapons funneled through Blackwell. His breath caught in his throat, and for the first time in days, a crack appeared in the thick walls of his suspicion. Catherine leaned forward, her voice urgent, desperate. "Take it. Take everything. Just make sure it gets out. Make sure they can't bury it." Collins nodded, his professional calm returning. He slid the evidence into a secure, hard-shelled case. At the same time, Sophia pulled out a small digital recorder, her hands steady now, her journalistic instincts taking over. "With your permission, Catherine," she said, "I'd like you to give me a statement. Names, dates, the entire chain of command. The world needs to hear this story from you." Before Catherine could answer, the vast, sacred silence of the library fractured. The heavy creak of the front doors opening. The sound of heavy boots on the marble floor below. Then voices, low, commanding, far too loud for this quiet place. John's blood ran cold. He had been so focused on the agent, he hadn't been listening to the building. "They're here," he hissed. Collins snapped the case shut and pulled Catherine to her feet. "We need to move. Now." But it was already too late. Dark figures were fanning out through the main reading room, their long coats concealing the weapons beneath. And then Marcus Kane himself stepped into their aisle. His face was hard as carved stone, his eyes cold and empty. He fixed his gaze on Catherine, the look of a predator that has finally, patiently, cornered its prey. "End of the road," he called out, his voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. "Hand her over, Carter. And maybe, just maybe, your boy gets to walk away from this." Eli stiffened, his small hand clutching Ruth's so tightly her knuckles whitened. Ruth pulled him behind her, instinctively shielding him with her own body. John raised the rifle he'd been carrying concealed under his long coat. His body became a wall between Marcus Kane and the people he had sworn to protect. His voice was low, steady, and filled with a cold, deadly promise. "You'll have to go through me." Marcus smirked, a cruel, confident twist of his lips. He lifted a hand and gave a small, subtle signal. His men spread out wider, their movements fluid and practiced, cutting off all the exits. The quiet hush of the library had turned into a cage. "The archives," Sophia whispered urgently. "There's a service stairwell in the back. It leads to the street." "Move," John ordered, his eyes locked on the enemy. Collins grabbed Catherine's arm, guiding her toward the back of the stacks. Ruth hustled Eli along, her lips pressed into a thin, grim line, her eyes darting nervously. Sophia stayed close behind them, clutching her recorder like it was a weapon of its own. John began to step backward, his rifle steady, buying them precious seconds. Marcus's men advanced, their boots thudding against the marble floor, a slow, methodical drumbeat. Then the first shot cracked through the air, and the sacred calm of the library was shattered into a million pieces. Glass exploded from a display case. Books rained down from the shelves like dead birds, and chaos tore through the air. John fired back, his shots precise, controlled, not aimed to kill but to suppress. Screams echoed through the grand hall as civilians scattered for cover, librarians diving behind their heavy wooden desks. Marcus's voice roared above the noise, ordering his men forward, his confidence unshaken. John knew this wasn't just another fight. This was the choke point. This was the final battleground. This was the place where the tide would either break their pursuers or drown them all for good. And as the echo of gunfire thundered through the grand, silent halls of the Denver Public Library, he understood with a cold, brutal clarity that the only way out was through the fire. Gunfire tore through the Denver Public Library, the echoes ricocheting off the high marble walls and towering shelves of books, the air filled with the dust of shattered plaster and the smell of cordite. Paper rained down like snow as bullets splintered the heavy oak shelves and shattered ornate glass lamps. John Carter was crouched behind a heavy reading table, the wood groaning as a fresh volley of shots slammed into it. His rifle was braced on the tabletop, his heart hammering a steady, controlled rhythm against his ribs. This was his world now. The chaos was a familiar element. Across the room, Marcus Kane advanced with a calm, terrifying precision. His dark suit was still immaculate, a stark contrast to the destruction erupting around him. His men fanned out in disciplined arcs, their boots thudding on the marble floor like the drumbeat of an approaching execution. "Carter?" Marcus's voice boomed, cold and certain, cutting through the din. "You can't win this. It's over. Hand her over and I'll let the boy walk. You have my word." John leaned out from behind the table, squeezed off 2 quick shots that sent 2 of Kane's men scrambling for cover behind marble pillars. "Your word isn't worth the powder it would take to kill you," he growled back. Behind him, Agent Collins shoved Catherine toward the archive stairwell, his own sidearm raised and firing. "Move!" he barked at the others. "Go! Go! Go!" Ruth half dragged, half pushed a terrified Eli along, shielding his head with her body. Sophia followed close behind, her camera bag and recorder clutched to her chest like lifelines. They disappeared into the narrow stairwell as John laid down another burst of covering fire, keeping Kane's men pinned down. Then he ducked back, slapped a fresh magazine into his rifle, and followed them into the echoing stairwell. The archives were a maze of gray metal shelves and flickering fluorescent lights, smelling of dust and old ink. Collins led them at a run through rows of microfilm cabinets, his pace urgent. "There's a service exit at the far end," he said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It opens onto 14th Street. We can get to my car from there." "Unless they've got men waiting for us," John muttered, his eyes scanning every shadow. He glanced at Eli. The boy's face was pale, his body trembling, but he was holding on. He clung to Ruth's hand, his small jaw set with the same stubborn determination as his father's. They reached the steel door at the far end of the archives, just as Marcus's voice echoed down the stairwell behind them. "Carter, you're only making it worse for yourself. Think about the boy." John shoved the heavy door open, and they spilled out into the bright, jarring noise of the city. Morning traffic hummed past, horns blared, commuters walked by with coffee cups in their hands, completely oblivious to the life-or-death battle that had just taken place inside the quiet library. Collins pointed to a black sedan parked half a block away. "There!" They sprinted for it, their boots pounding on the pavement. Catherine's bundle of evidence thudded against her chest with every jarring step. Behind them, Kane's men burst from the library's main doors, their weapons drawn. Shouts erupted. The bubble of city peace was shattered. John spun, firing back down the street to cover the others as they ran. Cars screeched to a halt. Civilians screamed and scattered across the sidewalks. The normal sounds of the city turned into the soundtrack of a war zone. Collins shoved Catherine into the back of the sedan, then Ruth and Eli. Sophia dove in after them, landing in a heap on the floor. John kept firing, the crack of his rifle sharp and precise. He backed toward the car, never turning his back on the enemy. Marcus Kane strode out into the open, his own pistol raised. For a split second, their eyes met across the chaos of the street. The predator and the soldier, each unwilling to yield. A bullet sang past John's shoulder, tearing a neat hole in the sedan's door. He ducked, rolled, and dove into the back seat. "Drive!" he roared. Collins slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as the sedan bolted out into traffic. Horns blared, brakes squealed, but Collins weaved through the cars with the practiced skill of a man who had done this many times before. Behind them, Kane's men piled into their own vehicles, black SUVs with tinted windows. Their engines roared, and the chase was on. The sedan barreled down Colfax Avenue, weaving between city buses and delivery trucks. Catherine clutched the evidence case, her knuckles white. Eli clung to Ruth, his small body shaking but silent, his eyes wide. John leaned out the back window, firing at the pursuing cars. Sparks flew as his bullets ripped into their grills and windshields. Sophia twisted in her seat, fumbling with her camera. "I need to get this on record," she gasped, her voice frantic. "If I don't get footage, if I don't broadcast this, it all dies in silence. They'll just invent a story." "Keep your head down," John barked, yanking her down just as the rear windshield shattered into a spiderweb of cracks from an incoming bullet. Collins swung the sedan hard onto a side street, the tires screaming in protest. One of the chasing SUVs clipped a light pole and spun out in a shower of sparks, but the other one, Kane's vehicle, stayed tight on their tail, its heavy bumper almost kissing theirs. "Too close," John growled. He leaned out again, took careful aim at their front tire, and fired. The pursuer's tire blew. The SUV swerved wildly, fishtailing into a row of parked cars with a gut-wrenching scream of tortured metal. Flames erupted from under its hood. The sedan sped on, but Marcus's car remained, a black, sleek shark, relentless and closing in. Collins swerved onto 14th Street, heading toward the gold dome of the Capitol building. "We need witnesses!" he shouted through gritted teeth. "If we can make it public, they can't cover it up." "No!" Catherine gasped, her eyes wide with a new terror. "Marcus owns the police, half the suits in this city. They won't help us. They'll arrest us and we'll disappear." "Then we take it higher," Sophia said, her voice trembling but fierce. "A live broadcast. The news vans are camped outside the Capitol every single morning. If I can get there, if I can get a camera rolling, he can't just shoot us in broad daylight without the whole world watching." John's eyes narrowed. It was dangerous. It was insane. But it was maybe the only shot they had left. "Do it!" Collins nodded, swerving hard toward Lincoln Street. The gold dome of the Capitol building gleamed ahead, bathed in the bright morning sun. Marcus's car closed the final gap, weaving through traffic with a terrifying, fluid precision. His passenger window rolled down. His pistol was leveled directly at them. "Down!" John roared, dragging Catherine and Eli to the floorboards. Shots tore through the back of the car. Ruth threw her body over the boy, shielding him. Collins swung the car hard one last time, mounting the curb with a jarring crash. The sedan skidded to a stop directly in front of a cluster of white news vans parked near the Capitol steps. Cameramen turned, startled by the noise, then instantly raised their lenses, their professional instincts taking over. "Out!" John shouted. They spilled from the car like soldiers from a transport. Catherine clutched the evidence case. Sophia shoved her own small camera into the hands of a startled crewman, screaming at him to roll, to go live, to broadcast now. Reporters swarmed them, microphones flashing, cameras broadcasting their raw, terrified faces to the world. Catherine stepped forward. She was shaking, her clothes were torn, but she was unbroken. She lifted the case high above her head. Her voice rang out, raw but clear, amplified by a dozen microphones. "This is proof," she shouted. "Proof that Blackwell Defense is selling weapons to our enemies. These are the ledgers, the microfilm. They killed people to keep this hidden. Don't let them silence the truth." The crowd of reporters erupted. Cameras zoomed in on the case, on her face. Questions were shouted. The noise swelled, a tidal wave of truth pushing back against the years of lies and silence. Across the street, Marcus Kane's car skidded to a stop. He stepped out, his weapon still raised, his eyes fixed on Catherine with pure, murderous hatred. For a single, silent heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then dozens of cameras swiveled toward him. Every lens caught the pistol in his hand, the undisguised fury on his face. He was no longer a shadow. He was the villain of the story, broadcast live in high definition. "Drop it!" Agent Collins barked, his FBI badge flashing in the sun as he leveled his own weapon. "You're done, Kane." Marcus hesitated. His eyes flicked from the cameras to the growing crowd, to the woman who had just gutted his entire empire on public television. His jaw clenched. John stood beside Catherine, his rifle steady, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. Eli clung to Ruth's hand, his wide eyes watching the man who had haunted their flight across the mountains. For the first time since this began, Marcus Kane looked uncertain. He was trapped. With a snarl of pure rage, he lowered the gun. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. The crowd pressed in, reporters shouting, cameras rolling, the evidence already spilling across live news feeds all over the world. Catherine's shoulders finally sagged with the weight of it all. But her grip on John's arm tightened. She had survived. They all had. But John knew the fight wasn't over. Marcus Kane might fall. Blackwell might crumble. But the shadows that created men like him didn't vanish overnight. He looked at his boy, safe in Ruth's protective embrace. Then he looked at Catherine and Sophia, standing strong in the eye of the storm they had created. And for the first time in a very long time, John Carter allowed himself a flicker of hope. They had dragged the truth, kicking and screaming, into the light. Now they would have to learn how to live in it. If you were on the edge of your seat through this story and believe that truth is always worth fighting for, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of survival and justice.